Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lemick, the founder of the Wounded Workforce, and I am so excited to have another amazing panel here today to talk about our final principle of trauma-informed cultures, cultural, historical, and gender issues. As always, we have an amazing group of experts ready to join us, and I am excited to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. And I will go ahead and let you introduce yourself first, Silas.
Oh, I'll usually say ladies first, but I guess I'm the only guy here today. So here we go. So good to be with you all today. A little quick background on myself. So I'm Silas Doolin, Associate Vice President of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Black and Beach. We are a EPC company based in Kansas City on the Kansas side. I've been with Black and Beach. I'm going on right around 9 months, give or take, coming in as Associate Vice President. A little bit of my background. I started my first big boy job was in supply chain at Sprint here in Kansas City. From there, I went to higher education. I was a director of multicultural affairs at a small liberal arts college called Baker University, which also happens to be my alma mater. From there, I went to another EPC company called Kiewit. It's where Steph and I first met a handful of years ago. I won't tell how long ago that was, Stephanie, but it was over a decade to date us for a second. But started there as a financial business manager, worked at 2 nuclear facilities and air quality control plant. And then from there, worked in recruiting, was the university recruiting manager for a couple of years. Left that and then went into the utility space, was a senior HR business partner for the local utility here in Kansas City called Evergy. Did that for a handful of years. And then still at Evergy, worked in power marketing. So I got to buy and sell and trade power. Then from there, went into becoming the first leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Evergy, set that program up and did that for about 4 years, left that role. And now I'm at Black and Beach again as Associate Vice President of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So a little bit about me.
Amazing. And thank you for not tattling on us with how long ago it was we were at Kiewit together. It feels like just yesterday, though.
Absolutely.
Great to have you. Thanks, Silas. Yvette.
Wow, hard to follow up that introduction. Really great to be here, everyone. And thank you, Stephanie, for putting this together and getting us together. It's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally. And I guess a bit of background about myself. I come from the field of industrial organizational psychology. It's simply the study of behavior in the workplace. So currently I wear many hats, the main ones being I manage people operations at Venn Software, which is where Stephanie and I met. And yeah, one of the best things that happened was that, I got the honor and privilege to work with Stephanie for a short time there. And so I manage people operations there. One big component is a focus on DEIB. And so I think it ties in very nicely to our discussion today. I also am the founder of Lark Hill Consulting, where I help individuals really level up their careers and, try to give everyone a really good shot at advancing their careers in their respective fields. So thank you again, Stephanie. Really great to share the stage with each of you.
It's great to have you. Thanks for being with us, Yvette. Erin.
Well, so glad to be here. Well, let's see a little bit about me. So I'm based here outside of San Francisco. So no surprise, more recently in the last 15 years, I've mostly worked, more than 15, in tech. So my background is first in strategy, change, or development, and then I moved my way into HR. So I worked for companies like Cisco, VMware, which now is bought by Broadcom, eBay, started my own business called Be Change Coach, doing fractional HR work and fractional chief people officer work. And then most recently, I was at Pinterest as the SVP of Leadership and Culture there. And DEI is very near and dear to my heart. I'm also a advisor for a company called Fair and Square that has a inclusion metric that I'm very excited about. So been doing a lot of work in this space as I've kind of been looking at my next chief people officer role and what's in the future. So I'm excited to be here today. I got a chance to meet Stephanie. I think our paths crossed at like was it a Burson conference? Or maybe it was maybe it was a Better Up.
Uplift. It was a Better Up conference. Yes, we were all trying to get a chance to see Prince Harry.
Exactly.
He was there. It was awesome. It was very cool. As cool as I thought it would be, it was even cooler to meet you, Erin. So glad to have you on board, and excited to talk about that inclusion metric a little bit later in our conversation. And last, certainly not least, one of the coolest people I know, Jess.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm so excited to be here. A little bit about me. So I have done most of my prior work experience, particularly focusing within nonprofits, really prioritizing educational inequity. And so I worked in higher ed for a little bit. Actually, Silas, I worked at my alma mater as well. So we've got something in common there. And then moved on to some community-based organizations and then larger national organizations like City Year. And then I made the switch over to corporate. And it was a really interesting switch to go from nonprofits into a life sciences corporation like Waters. It's been a great experience, and I lead our global DEI work there. I'm super excited to be here and talking about the work that I've done in the past at previous organizations related to trauma-informed workplaces, and also in my work as the founder of Intersectional Impact Consulting, where I do a lot of work supporting organizations with training, unconscious bias training, and just building more awareness about DEI. And then I think the thing that I find just the most exciting is the work that I do around books. You can see my beautiful library behind me, which is like my pride and joy besides my children. And I actually am a book influencer online, and I read a ton of books, about 100 books a year, review them, contribute to different, pop articles about books and about, books that are really popular and prevalent. And that's actually how I met Stephanie, through some book club conversations where I had the opportunity to just lead a lot of really great discussions about books, interview different authors, and I also do beta and sensitivity reading for authors as well. So I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit more about trauma-informed workplaces.
I told you guys Jess was super cool. And if you want to change your life, diversify your bookshelf, because just the stories, the different perspectives, just the connection you can feel when you're reading, it's so amazing. And Jess always has amazing recommendations from all sorts of different genres. So absolutely check out the work she does on Bookstagram. So thrilled to have you all here. I always like to start from a place of clarity when we have these discussions. So I'm going to start out with a little summary talking about our principle we're addressing today: cultural, historical, and gender issues. And then you guys won't have to hear from me as much, and we'll hear more from our fantastic panelists here. So trauma-informed workplaces seek to acknowledge the prevalence of trauma in our society and build processes and cultures that support everyone, regardless of traumatic experiences. A key aspect of trauma-informed cultures is an awareness around cultural, historical, and gender issues that interact with trauma both at an individual and systemic level. Gender, cultural, and historical or generational experiences influence the experience and perception of trauma. Societal expectations, power dynamics, and culture norms associated with these factors can contribute to diverse types and intensities of trauma. Some examples include, but certainly are not limited to, women often facing higher rates of sexual assault and domestic violence, leading to trauma associated with those experiences, differing cultural perceptions and expectations on speaking about or addressing traumatic experiences, racially motivated violence, such as hate crimes or police brutality, systemic racism, prejudice, and other acts of hate, historical trauma resulting from the collective experiences of racism, such as intergenerational trauma passed down through generations, including slavery, colonization, genocide, and forced displacement. So today we're going to focus on both DEI efforts and initiatives and trauma-informed workplaces, and look at the intersection of this important work in both these spaces and how advancing both trauma-informed cultures and DEI initiatives can benefit us all. So we'll go ahead and kick off with our panel questions. And our first question, and whoever wants to jump in first, you go right ahead. Well, the unmuting Olympics, we'll call it. I would love to start with, why is this topic important to you, either personally or professionally or both?
I'm happy to kick this one off, Stephanie. Like I said in the introduction, this topic is very near and dear to my heart. Personally, it's important to me because I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I think it's extremely difficult to find someone in this community who hasn't had a negative experience or reaction in their life. And in fact, just over a year ago, by a couple days, the Club Q shooting happened less than 10 minutes from where I live in Colorado Springs. It's somewhere that my partner and I could definitely have been at that night. And obviously it was very jarring and shook me up. I think, we see these acts of hate happen across the country nearly every day. But it's extremely scary and shocking when it hits so close to home. So I think that, the fact that these acts of violence continue to happen without change, of course it's exhausting, but personally it motivates me to continue fighting for change. Really to use my platform for the better. I guess switching over to the professional side, I think being a member of the community and being open about it in the workplace it's brought about both positive and negative experiences for me. I want to say that for the most part, most people are positive and supportive, and I've had, good positive experiences just in being myself and being open. However, there are those occasions when, I do get a negative reaction, and usually they're subtle. It can be a change in attitude or just avoidance. But again, I think much like, my personal take on this, these experiences just, they push me and motivate me to focus on education of DE&I, promoting awareness, and, continuously striving to foster culturally aware, equitable, and inclusive workplace cultures.
I'm happy to go next. And apologies, I had one of my little tiny humans join me a little bit before. The second I heard the door open, I was like, "Oh no, is it the big one or the little one?" And it was the little one. But yeah. So I think this is a great question, Yvette. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I can imagine we all are going to share like that personal piece so much, because I think you have to have that personal connection in order to do this a lot of times. Because there's so much of that negative weight and negative burden that we can experience and walk through the world, especially if we're leading DEI or anti-racism or other anti-oppression work. For me, I think that it's so important personally, because I want to make sure in like every interaction that I have, that I am centering the human and like humanity around me. And I think that sometimes we can get caught up in whatever the grind is, right? Capitalism or hustle culture or just like life in general. And we forget that we are humans and that the people around us are humans. And we can't just shut off that like humanity when we walk into a workplace, right? We're going to bring all of those experiences with us. And I think a lot about, obviously like 2019, then leading up to 2020 and COVID, and then the murder of George Floyd, right? And I think sometimes people use, and I myself included, can use the murder of George Floyd as like this like waking up position. But I think for many people, we were experiencing that same trauma many years before, right? And the things that really got me through that, when I would wake up and be like, wow, I really don't want to go into the office and have to do this work or have to do any work because I'm exhausted, like physically and mentally, were working with other people who were in the same boat, right? Like working with other Black women who are experiencing a lot of this trauma and this burden, and being able to like walk into someone's office, especially when I was at nonprofits, and be like, the stuff that's happening in the real world and the stuff we're doing at work and the stuff I'm doing with DEI, all of this stuff is just like one big heavy burden. And without having that opportunity to engage with people and really, share the ways that the trauma was impacting us, I honestly don't think that I would have survived, like, quite frankly, as a real human. And it was extremely hard, even with that support. So for me, I think I just try and always remember that I'm a human, and the way that I operate is going to be impacted by the things that I'm experiencing. And I need to remember that about other people as well, whether it's in my personal or my professional life.
Yeah, I love that so much, Jess. I think, I remember when, it used to be like work-life balance, right? It was like, oh, there's work, and then there's this whole separate being that's you, right? And then it kind of started to blur. And then now it's just vanished, right? I think with, you know, I think your little human, I don't know, son, daughter, someone who came in, right? It's like a perfect example, right? Of just when suddenly work enters your home in like a deep and profound way, right? It forces us in many ways to be more and more human, and to like more and more recognize like, hey, like I can't separate, work Aaron and like professional Aaron, right? And I think we're going to see that even more with, we've seen that more with social media, right? We'll see that even more with like Gen AI and how that all comes to bear and how that influences the workplace, right? And so for me, part of what I care about this topic from two places, right? One is like, as a chief people officer, I care about it because what I know is when employees are engaged, developed, respected, like they're seen as humans, like it's a win-win for everybody, right? They're going to innovate more. You're going to connect and collaborate and solve like more complex problems together. Like the company is going to do better, right? Like, and there's a lot of individual and collective drama that like, trauma that keeps us from playing big, right? And everybody's bringing whatever it may be, right? I saw, as like a chief people officer nerd, like I saw a really interesting statistic that that really soon Gen Z is going to surpass boomers in the workforce. And Gen Z, of all the generations, has the least positive outlook and the highest prevalence of mental health issues. And like it's no worry. Like it's no wonder, right? There's so much trauma, and we see so much trauma and experience so much trauma, and yet, in many ways, we don't have the option, not that we should have before, right, to sit back and do nothing, right? It's here, it's right in front of us in our very blended lives. And so, for me, like I see it as it's like it's an imperative, right? Those that ignore and pull back on DEI efforts and creating those psychologically safe workplaces now, they're going to lose in the end when we're not in a talent surplus, right? When we start to see future labor shortages and disruptions with AI, right? And as a human, obviously, I care about it, because I care about like what workplaces will future generations work on, right? I mean, as like a privileged, cisgender, neurodiverse, white female leader, I have a very important role to play, right? It's like I walk in tremendous circles of privilege. And yet I also, experience and know the feeling of being othered as a neurodiverse woman, right? And, as an aunt and a mom, like I want that for my generations and I want that for all your generations, right? I mean, we deserve better in a workplace.
Not really sure how I follow any of that up. All I can do is validate what has been stated. Yvette, you bring up the nightclub shooting. Jess, you bring up being post George Floyd, and Aaron, you speak about the blurring of lines. So when we think about this concept of why this is important to have a trauma-informed workforce, when we take that oath as being a D&I practitioner, a chief people officer, and the like, it is ultimately our fiduciary responsibility to ensure, like Aaron says, psychological safety. So as we think about this from an organizational perspective, there's two things that we again have a fiduciary responsibility to try to guarantee. It's psychological and physiological safety, having those both in our workforce and our environments. And so kind of piggybacking again off of Jess's point of George Floyd, of this awakening situation, we have situations like that, nightclub shootings, to Yvette's point, to where for those of us that those communities affect, we have to pretend like we're okay when we're in the workforce, right? So again, to Aaron's point of having to show up when these lines are blurred, there's no more of the days of this thing could happen in my environment, and I have to show up at the workplace and pretend like this isn't affecting me from a police perspective, from a gender perspective, from an LGBTQ plus perspective. We have that opportunity now as practitioners to ensure that you have a psychological and physiological safe work environment. Because at the end of the day, I know for my organization, we talk a lot about psychological safety. We deal with very dangerous products. We're building, infrastructure, right? We're dealing with electricity, right? We're doing all these dangerous things. But I also have to say that a distracted workforce is an unsafe workforce. So if your head is not in the game when it comes to the things that we're doing from a risk perspective, these concepts of psychological safety really come into play, because again, a distracted workforce is an unsafe workforce, unsafe workplace as well too. So for me professionally and personally, these are the things that we need to be doing. And again, to borrow some elements from Aaron's speech, is this Generation Z, they're also known as the most intolerant generation of intolerance. And the way that their workforce and the way their workplace is going to look is very different than how it looks right now. So again, to piggyback off of Aaron's point too, to think about the psychological sanity that there has to be in these environments, the ante has been upped essentially to be able to attract, retain, and sustain that diverse talent that we want, that is known as Generation Z. So professionally, this is why we do it from a practitioner perspective. And personally, I'm raising small humans myself. I've got a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old, right? In the world in which they are going to work into, this is a paying forward example of what we're trying to do to ensure that their work environments are psychological and physiologically safe. The last thing I'll say too, I knew this was going to happen. We're going to get going on these tangents. It's already half past the hour, but I will say one more thing. In a lot of ways, and my practitioners know this too, we get to create environments, maybe the safest environments for some of our professionals, right? So we think about these, we also get to develop almost life-saving mechanisms for our employees as well too. So we think about this from a traumatic perspective, we think about this from a psychological perspective. Our environments are the safest places in some situations, but they also provide resources and outlets to be life-saving mechanisms for our professionals. So I'll stop there.
Amazing, amazing answers, all of you. And I never give enough time for these conversations. I'm always like, an hour is plenty, and then it never is enough. And when it comes to Gen Z, this is the thing I've started telling folks when they think about recruiting, retaining Gen Z. Millennials were ready to hand out gold stars for organizations having DEI initiatives, efforts, and they were happy. They're like, oh, great job, gold star. Gen Z is not. The Gen Z is like, yeah, you better have a DEI program. So that investment it's like oh, you better. It's not a cool gold star. Gen Z is like amping up accountability when it comes to organizations. And that certainly is on the diversity, equity, inclusion front. It's certainly on mental health, trauma-informed workplaces front as well. So love we're talking about that. So the next question I would love to hear from this group on is, how can trauma-informed workplace cultures support the success of DEI programs? Anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it does is it forms a foundation, right? So the more that we can understand the perspectives of others, the more that we can get resources from our workforce to better understand ourselves, right? The better that we can then sort of like, I would say, like, start from the foundation, because you have to have that psychological safety, like, first, like that's the foundation to build on before you can get some of these, I would say, a little bit more advanced, maybe is not the right word, like DEI topics and conversations going. But if you don't have the psychological safety of really a trauma-informed workplace, you don't even have the starting point.
I think it's really important too to have, again, like Aaron was saying, the foundation. You have to have the infrastructure in place for the talent that you say that you want, right? So if you think about the people, the young people, the older people, all people in our organization that we're trying to bring in, all of us are affected by trauma one way or the other. So you think about from an upbringing perspective, there are certain things that have happened to all of us that cause triggers. So when we think about, for example, if I have a negative experience with a Marine, for example, to think about this from a psychological perspective, I can't now deem all Marines as bad people, right? You can insert any demographic into that space, right? But the trauma-informed workforce stuff, I love this concept. It ultimately provides awareness of what could be triggering, what could be daunting, what could cause a person to have an adverse response to whomever is in position of authority. As we think about the historical relics of racism, the historical relics of gender, of xenophobia, homophobia, and the like, you know, the space that I get to play in, I'm sure Jess can talk about this as well too, from a global perspective. You know, a large part of my organization is in India. So you have the historical effects of the caste system, right? So as you think about these traumas that happen, so if you have this boss that reminds you of that person that you ran into or that bully that you had in high school, it's the concept of us being able to articulate ourselves of, hey, I'm triggered by this, and here's why. And to provide those mechanisms in order for us to have, again, a psychological and physiological safe work environment for our professionals as we move it forward. So the concept of how D&I intersects with that, D&I does provide the foundation to be able to bring these topics up. Because the only time that you are essentially allowed to talk about these topics is when the organization makes it okay to talk about these topics, right? It's very hard to bring these conversations into the proverbial break room if there isn't a foundation to make it psychologically safe to bring up these topics. So that's, in my opinion, that's where D&I kind of comes in, as you said before, is it's to become table stakes for Generation Z. So you better have a DE&I leader in your organization, or else I'm not working there. Because when we look at this historically, these foundational principles allow us the space for people to see themselves in organizations. It allows people to feel comfortable in who they are. It allows people to be their best selves at work. So that's where the intersection comes in for me. It's foundational for us to build upon creating platforms for us to have these informed conversations for awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both Aaron and Silas said, and I think that foundational piece is so important. To me, it feels as if they are like intertwined without, like, you can't really separate them, right? Because if you're putting forth any kind of DEI initiative, but you're not basing it in empathy and like humanity and recognizing that people have different experiences and those different experiences can lead to different outcomes, and like really treating people with care, then your initiatives aren't necessarily going to be successful, right? Because people, again, are going to you're asking them to bring their full selves into an organization, and their full self is not just like happy-go-lucky person who's walking through the door and is super hyped to be at work, right? Like that person is going to be frustrated about things, is going to be triggered about things, is going to struggle with things based on their own experiences or based on what's happening in the world. And so you can't necessarily have these DEI initiatives without having them rooted in this understanding of trauma-informed workplaces, of psychological safety, of empathy, because it's just going to end up being like this tokenistic diversity effort where you're like, everything is shiny, but you're not actually digging to the root of how people are showing up and how they're bringing themselves to work. And I think that it is also something that's really critical to make sure that we are addressing things in real time, right? To make sure that we're checking in with people, looking at them as full humans that are impacted by things, and recognizing that the way that we approach these strategies, the way that we approach these initiatives might need to be different depending on what is happening, depending on the group that we're trying to target. And that kind of stuff is just super critical to the success of the work. So for me, it feels so intertwined that you can't really approach DEI without having that thoughtfulness around how people are going to show up, what's going to impact them, and how their specific identities are going to be really critical to the way that they walk into their workplace every day.
Amazing. Such great answers. So I'd love to ask, one thing that I think is important for us to be effusive about is what meaningful action, what meaningful commitment to DEI really looks like within an organization. And, if you can share, examples or, share a quick hit, I think it's important for folks to understand, what that looks like for it to really be meaningful and impactful.
I'll be the big penguin to break the ice on this one. So I would say probably the number one thing for D&I to be successful is tone from the top. And what I mean by that is that your senior most leader, your CEO, your chairman, your your president needs to be bought into diversity, equity, and inclusion, because without that, it is absolutely going to go nowhere, right? As I referenced before with my organization, I was actually brought in by our CEO. And so he was the final stop, the final interview, and the whole entire process to where our short conversation turned into a very large and extensive conversation, which at that point in time, I knew that I had someone that really got DE&I, right? So just anecdotally, I would say tone from the top is probably the most important, crucial thing in this space. And then, yeah, I'll leave it at that because I know everyone else has the right answer. So in sake of time, I'll leave it at that, tone from the top. Final answer.
Silas, I'm going to piggyback off of you. I agree that that message and the actions have to come from the top and then transcend through the rest of the organization, to be actionable and relevant and show commitment and be successful ultimately. You have to have senior leadership playing a part, being that example, understanding their own biases, I think, and making sure that, through both verbal and action, that the importance of DEI work is coming from them. And, I think also on top of that, it's up to everyone in an organization to play a part in being accountable and holding each other accountable. That means calling out behavior that doesn't align with those values of DEI, whether it's your coworker or your boss. It's up to everyone to make sure that a certain standard is being upheld.
Plus one. And I think one thing that I've really enjoyed about kind of getting more into people analytics is looking at ways to help give people feedback and help hold them accountable, right, in like a positive way. So there's ways that there's questions you can include on an engagement survey. There's things like the inclusion metric that I mentioned with fair and square. There's ways to be able to get feedback on how are you showing up as an inclusive leader, right? How are you really how are people seeing you walk the walk? That I think is really helpful feedback to get, because sometimes you haven't created the psychological safety for somebody to be able to bring something up, right? And I feel like personally, as a leader, I know that I've done a great job of creating psychological safety when somebody who works for me says something that makes me feel simultaneously embarrassed and ashamed that I said something, and also very proud that I created that psychological safety that they could call me out on my bullshit. Right? It's like, then now you've done it. You've created enough psychological safety that somebody who's worked for you has said, yeah, the reason that you're saying that is because there's a stereotype of A, B, and C. You're right. Oh, God. I'm an idiot. Thank you for telling me. So I think how you can set up those feedback loops for leaders and as a company and make it safe, because we're as much as we try to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, you can't fully, and you're gonna make mistakes as a leader and a human, right? And so that feedback is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I just double stamp everything that everybody said, and I think it's so important to make sure that you have that influence from the top, that you're really building those strong cultures. The only other thing that I would add is resources. I think that when organizations actually put significant resources behind whatever their DEI initiatives are, that's when you really can see a lot of success. And that resource can be a lot of different things. I think we tend to go towards funding, right? And budget, which is super important. But skills and capability resources, building the skills of the people who are leading that work, making sure that you have people resources, and that the people who are doing the work, especially if they're volunteering, are getting paid for that extra work, right? Because otherwise you're in this cycle of just continued burnout and continued burden. And quite honestly, and I've seen this at some of my previous organizations, is taking advantage of the people who are passionate about this work. And that's not going to lead to a great cycle. And so really making sure that we are, as an organization, that we're uplifting the people who are leading DEI, providing them the support that they need through those resources, whatever they may be, and making sure that we're really supporting those folks as well with their own mental health. Because I know there's some days when I leave the work, the office, and I'm just weighed down, right? You're just weighed down because you've talked to people who've had stressful experiences, or, I'm thinking about the things that are happening in the world and how I can make sure to support people who are in the office. And this isn't even just at my work currently. This is literally the entire, 10 years that I've been leading DEI work. And that is really exhausting. And so ensuring that the folks who are leading DEI are getting that support internally and externally, really supporting them and creating that network that they need to survive, because this work can be extremely draining.
Hey, Steph, I'm going to take a second bite of the apple and double down on something that Yvette said. I just want to drive this point home. Perfect. The other aspect is the accountability component that Yvette talked about. So there are no other departments, functions of the organization that does not have KPIs, right? So for measurability, from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint, those must also be instituted, because if you only have tone from the top and you only have resources, essentially it just becomes talk. So it's ensuring that you have accountability that's baked into this, as well as what responsibilities and obligations do you have that's measurable from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint, also has to be baked into the realness of making this work for any organization, whether it be a for-profit or nonprofit. So accountability also, again, to double down what Yvette said, has to be built into this strategy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have the accountability. And I'm sure you all know this, but just for the recording, right, to move away from it just being a diversity stat to true measurable ways that you're showing inclusive behaviors, that you're modeling things in the workplace, right? Because we all know you could bring in a whole group of really diverse people, like burn them out, cycle them out, hire new ones, right? And that's never going to get you. All you're going to do is you're going to create the trauma workforce, not the trauma informed workforce.
Yeah, it's having clear and concise definition of what does diversity mean for your organization. Are we talking about pigment? Are we talking about gender? What are we talking about here, right? So to that point, that's the scary part a lot of times for leadership, is to keep them out of the perils of tokenism and quotas, is to clearly define what we mean when we say diversity. So diversity is also not a dirty word, but diversity of thought. So in the space of having a disability inclusion strategy for those that are neurodivergent, ensuring that we have the appropriate level of infrastructure for veterans, having individuals in the organization that are of the LGBTQ plus community, right? So it's all those mechanisms as we think about it. And also too, one area that I really am trying to impress upon my fellow D&I practitioners, when we describe diversity, equity, and inclusion, we go to gender, right? We go to pigment, and we talk about veterans. We talk about, in some situations, immigrants. In some situations, we talk about those that are refugees. But the one that we don't talk about a lot is the R, and the R is rural, right? So for my organization, we are in middle America. We're in the good old Midwest. And a lot of times when we think about the rural population, that's not always thought about. And rural are also thought about as not being a part of this DE&I structure and strategy as well, too. So we have to think about this as being really all-inclusive, because no one ever said that diversity was an exclusive strategy. It's an inclusive strategy that activates all of us, because it's good for our people, it's good for our culture, it's good for our clients. So we have to think about it in those aspects. It does benefit all of us, and all of us have a part to play in the strategy. Back to Erin's point.
Ooh, I love that. That's amazing. So now I'm supercharging a question since we are running out of time. So it'll be a double whammy question, but I think it goes together nicely. Maybe a little bit of a hot topic, at least on, social media or news sites. How can organizations and individuals respond to backlash we sometimes see when it comes to DEI? And, as you think about being a leader in this space, what common misconceptions or misunderstandings of DEI efforts and programs are you most interested in dispelling?
Yeah, I'll piggyback off what I just said. Is the R, right? In a lot of ways, right? You think about, one of the things that us D&I practitioners are starting to re-up on is understanding we're going into an election year. And so we're seeing what's happening in the states of Florida, Texas, my home state of Oklahoma, Missouri, and the like, from a affirmative action perspective. So again, going back to the concept of completely and succinctly defining what does diversity, equity, and inclusion, and access mean to your organization is how you dispel the myth. Because what we're running into is a lot of noise, a lot of background chatter around what this topic is, but you get to define what it means for your organization, how it's going to show up, right? Is it for your people? Is it for your professionals? Or is it for your clients? Or is it for your community, right? So this also shows up in the spaces of environmental justice, right? This also shows up in the spaces of working with diverse suppliers. This also shows up in the concept of ensuring that, second chance workforce, those that are being re-entered into the population from a prison perspective, have opportunities for work. Those that are neurodivergent have work. All these things intersect across the board, and it really connects everyone in seeing the strategy. It's not an exclusive strategy. It's an inclusive strategy that includes all of us. So for me, it's understanding how are we defining it for our organization, and then what are the mechanisms to activate it, and then how do you measure it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many parts to this question, right? There's the backlash piece that kind of makes me think of media, or like a response within an organization. And I'm sure that most recently there were probably a lot of responses within organizations that maybe with the war going on in Gaza and Israel, there may have been like an initial response, and then oh, maybe there's other things we need to consider in this response kind of situation. Because I saw that a bit on LinkedIn and social media. So I could imagine that there's companies that are thinking about that, right? Like, how do we support not just our Jewish community, but our Palestinian community, right? Like, how do we support all of these different folks that may be going through a trauma? And did we perhaps kind of like jump to an immediate response without kind of knowing all the information? So I think with those, right, I think that's when you have to go back to your values as a company. You have to be willing to say, like, we didn't do it right. Like, yep, we screwed that up, friends. That was bad. Here's what we learned from it. Here's what we'll do differently next time. Here's what we're putting in place with our DEI strategy to kind of like, for us as a company to like look at how we respond to these things, right? Because I think, a lot of times the culture and our leadership fiber gets tested when all of a sudden there's a something, whatever it may be, and we kind of jump to whatever our initial reactions are. And then as we see things unfold and hear more information from people, right, and our employees, or we think about what this may mean for our customers, suddenly we think, ooh, perhaps we needed to see it from a really different picture, right?
Yeah. Erin, I want to follow up with that, and actually bring it back to something that Jess had mentioned in the beginning, which was, the murder of George Floyd coinciding with COVID, and I guess America and maybe the broader world having this wake up moment. For some, and the trend that we saw is, companies across the board jumped on, let's start a DEI initiative, but they didn't truly understand what that is. They didn't have a definition, like Silas has alluded to. They thought that, okay, we can just put together a random, uninformed, unequipped group of people, and they can make a successful DEI program. We've seen a lot of that be unsuccessful. And I think that is probably one of the biggest lessons learned, hopefully by organizations over the last 3 to 4 years. And so I hope that is a misconception that we can move past, and, be more intentional about how we create these things, making sure that we have the right people in the right places with the right resources, to ensure that we come to the right outcomes.
I think that the kind of backlash piece feels to me like such a complex conversation, right? And I think it always has been, but even more so now. Some of it, I think, is the media. A lot of it is social media, just how quick things are. And one of the things that I'm really intrigued by recently that I've seen some organizations do is create like a crisis communications team, right? That's a mix of a lot of different people across the organization, who are able to create a preparation plan for whenever something like this happens, whether it's just that initial kind of communication like Erin is talking about, or also that kind of like walk back, or we made a mistake that Erin's also talking about, right? Like sometimes I think it can be really easy to make those decisions in a vacuum, and that's when mistakes are going to happen, right? And I think kind of aligned to the backlash piece, what I think really Yvette, Silas, and Erin are all saying, and I'll add to just a little bit, is that the question that I always try to ask myself whenever I get any kinds of questions, pushback, challenges, or even like crisis of internal conscience, is like, who am I doing this for? Right? Like, what am I doing this for? And I think that's what organizations have to really think to themselves, right? Like, who is this ultimately for? If we're putting this statement out and we get some backlash, like, what is the impact? especially if we're rooted in that foundation of who this is for. If this is for the support of our employees, working, to make sure that they know that these are the values that we hold and the organization that they work at is going to stand for something, then yeah, you might get some backlash from some clients or some customers or some, external stakeholders. But ultimately, if it's for the people who you're supporting, who work with you, who work for you, then that backlash, what's the weight, what's weightier, what weighs more, what's more important? I know I'm simplifying this so much, right? But I think that kind of question needs to be at the forefront of everyone's mind. Who is this work for? Who are these statements for? Why are we doing this? Is it just to recruit, just to pander to Gen Z? Or is it because we actually believe this and we really want to make sure that the employees who work at this organization feel valued and supported and respected? So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that there's a right answer there, but I think if it's rooted in that question, I think it can help kind of guide the organization, and rooted in the values, as others said as well. And then kind of the last thing that I'll say around this dispelling piece, I think that I feel like I talk about this all of the time, but I feel like there's this myth that perfection is something that's real within DEI, which nobody is perfect, right? No organization is doing everything amazingly well. No person is the most perfect person who never makes a mistake. We are going to make mistakes. And I think oftentimes kind of this idea of DEI is that it's building this utopian society that's perfect and beautiful and fabulous. And the goal isn't that for me. The goal is this journey that we're going to take where we're all learning and growing together and opening our minds and centering humanity and centering empathy. That is the real awesome stuff that I want to see. When someone a flip is switched when I'm talking to someone, I'm yes. And that's not perfection by any means. The goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to grow, to challenge yourself, and to make it so that the people around you are making these little tiny steps so that those little tiny steps can build into this beautiful growth. I think we need to really dispel this myth that we're aiming towards this perfect goal. I think it does the entire, idea, the entire strategy, all of our work such a disservice. And we're really minimizing the beautiful steps that we want to take along the way.
I love that, Jess. Or that there could even be an end goal, right? Because I feel as soon as you would, if it were linear, as soon as you would get there, the bar would move, right? There'd be a new something, but it isn't linear, of course. But yeah, I love that. I love the growth aspect of it, because I think that's what puts you in kind of the mode of being curious, right? Which I think, Silas was talking about the election coming up and sort of people, some new, potentially new legal matters, people already being concerned about, am I going to do DEI wrong and what might that mean, right? And so that puts us in the defensive rather than the curious, right? So I think there's, opportunity to stay in that growth mindset. I love that.
Oh, I cannot believe we are almost out of time. This has been such an amazing conversation. I always wish I had a whole nother hour plus to talk to all of you. I always like to wrap up with recommendations from each of you for our audience, books, podcasts, whatever resource you think would be valuable for anyone that is wanting to learn more. And I will start with reader extraordinaire, Jess, for this question.
Yes, honestly, I want a shirt that says reader extraordinaire. I should probably find that from Etsy. Add it to my other bookish t-shirts. I have book earrings on right now, actually. So yes, of course, I'm going to recommend books. I think there's ones that a lot of people have probably heard of, right? The What My Bones Know, which I think came out last year, Stephanie Fu. The Body Keeps a Score, which I think is always, kind of in the conversation. One that I haven't read that I've seen a lot of and heard a lot of good things is My Grandmother's Hands, which is all about generational trauma by Resma Menachem. I'm sure that I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I've heard really good things about that. I like live and breathe Adrienne Maree Brown. So, their Instagram is just absolutely phenomenal. So always really highly recommend them. And then I want to share 2 books that I think can be helpful, particularly around grief, which sometimes I think can be connected to that trauma conversation. One I always have to talk about because it's written by my cousin, and it's called Grief is Love, bestseller. She wrote a beautiful, beautiful book about grief and how grief and trauma are really connected, and we can't really, push them to the side. It's going to be luggage and baggage that we carry wherever we go. And then the last one is actually a romance. Stephanie knows how much I love romance. But I love romance that has like real life things, because I think it can be an entry point for many people where nonfiction might not be their jam, right? And so Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan, which again deals a lot with grief and trauma, and particularly centers the importance of therapy and the importance of therapy not only for children, but for Black men and Black children in particular. And I think that just the way that like her research is beautiful, the way that she wove like how you deal with trauma and how trauma can impact you in work and in life and your relationships, and then the importance of like crawling yourself back out of that and what that looks like for different people, I think is truly phenomenal for any book, but I think especially like really touching for people who, might need a fiction or a romance book to help them kind of explore some of the inner things that they might not usually explore. So those are my recommendations.
And I'm going to say it. You have got to follow Jess on Instagram, and you're on TikTok also, right? TikTok. Seriously, like I'm telling you, life-changing. Jess will give you a life-changing bookshelf. Any kind of book you want to read as an amazing entry point into diverse perspectives. Amazing. Thank you so much. Erin, how about you? Oh, you're muted.
I have to follow the book reader extraordinaire. Like, oh no, the pressure. Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of audiobooks. So one audiobook that I love, that I just re-listened to, is White Women, right? And it's great as an audiobook because the authors read it and it's like, wow, it's like an extra wow. I'm really excited about reconstructing DEI that's coming out from Lily Zhang. And then if you have kids, I just went and heard Henry Winkler, the Fawns, speak last night. So he's dyslexic, and he has a whole bunch of dyslexic children's books. So I always love looking at like where can we bring in like various different like children's books perspectives, just so we kind of like frame people in the right way early on. So we have to fix them less later.
I love that. Those are awesome. Those are so great. Perfect. Yvette.
Yes. So it's interesting. I think it was earlier this year, I was introduced to the field of epigenetics, which was completely new to me. And it was at a virtual event with a guest speaker named Raj Kumari Neoji. So in a nutshell, epigenetics is the study of how your environment and behaviors directly cause changes to your genes and the way that your genes work. So basically, the health consequences of discrimination and systemic racism can be passed from one generation to the next through what researchers call the body's biological memory of harmful experience. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of research being done currently to understand this on a deeper level and observe that, transgenerational relationship. So back to the speaker, Raj Kumari is the CEO of I Belong, and they combine neurobiology and epigenetics to understand workplace exclusion and conflict to foster inclusive workplaces, which I think is awesome. So I have to highly recommend I Belong's podcast, which is called Then, Now, and Tomorrow.
So cool. Amazing. Thank you. Silas, round us out.
So thanks. So like Aaron, I'm a audio booker. I don't sit still enough to read. I drive a lot. So I've got one that's called God and Race. It's by John Siebling and Wayne Francis. It's really good. That takes some of Aaron's thunder. Well, is there's a children's book called Mixed. So I have biracial children, and it's by Ari Chung. And it talks about just 3 colors just mixing, and then how they aren't supposed to mix, and then how they just change each other's lives. And we have new colors based on the mixing. So fantastic book. And then the last thing I would say is there's a podcast that's on, I think I'm on Spotify, but it's called Jopwell, Jopwell. And it's about race in the workplace and how do you deal with that. So they bring in CHROs, CPOs, entrepreneurs in of how they've dealt with race in the workforce. So those are probably my 3 takeaways. And the one thing I'll add is a supplemental too. I was at a workforce development conference, I believe a week or 2 ago, and one of the topics was around the concept of trauma. And I forget what organization it was. It was a utility that talked about having kind of a first responder per floor that can intervene in situations of trauma that happen at your workplace. And the trauma is very broad topic, right? So as far as an actionable item, that's something I want to be looking into for my organization as to how do we have a first responder if said thing were to be happening in our workplace. So those are a couple of things that I'm thinking about in closure.
Amazing. What awesome recommendations. And I'm like ready to have even more conversations after this. Everyone, thank you so much for your time today. This was such an amazing conversation. For those of you listening in, make sure and mark your calendars for our final panel of the year. We'll be talking about compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, which is a lovely complement to this conversation. And so we will wrap up 2023 with that conversation here on LinkedIn and on Facebook. And until next time, be well. Thank you.